So what I was asked to do was to provide a bit of a practical example. Lots of talk today about getting from the theory to the practical. I had an opportunity to apply systems thinking, not so much design, although in retrospect I think there might have been some elements in it in what I'm going to present to you. But I didn't get exposed to design until last year in the National Security Program with Dr. Mitchell. Hadn't even heard the term. And even the system thinking part, I just fell into it by accident from my own studies, not from the military education system. So I'm thrilled to see that it's making its way formally into our organization. I believed a long time ago that systems theory was empowering to my organization. Again, I felt the frustrations, and once I recognized I identified with some of these theories, I thought they could be helpful in some of our change initiatives. I'd like to try and illustrate what I think is an example of the power of really even just the most basic elements of these theories, even though I'm going to use a tactical example. These are the actual slides that I use with my organization. I haven't changed them, and I want to use them to illustrate that. The problem I was given in 2012, I took over command of one wing, which is one of the Royal Canadian Air Force wings. It's the Army Aviation Wing. And I was given the task of a first principles redesign, and the focus really was on efficiencies because of the pressures of budgets and personnel numbers. So that was the task that I was given. Elements that I had to help my organization understand as we went through this process, including things like are on the quotes here on this first slide. As Bill Bentley pointed out, recognizing patterns instead of just events and isolated factors. And the issue of we are famous as leaders in trying to simplify issues. That's part of what we have to do. The problem is once you do that, it's not the real complexity of the real world anymore. Splitting an elephant in half doesn't create two small elephants. It creates a big mess. And if you don't realize that and translate back up into complexity, you have a lot of problems in trying to initiate change. Next slide. So I had to talk to my organization about not only my organization, but my chain of command as we were getting approvals for what we had designed. Why systems thinking, the difference between complicated and complex, the beer game that Senge talks about in the 5th discipline, and I'll talk about that, and then applying that in the military context. Next slide. This was the first thing I had to do with my organization, is get them to understand that the way they were looking at themselves was outdated. John Cotter in his book Leading Change uses this as an example, and I think it's a great illustration. If I give you a task, this is my living room, the TV is on one side, I give you a task, I want the TV on the other side of the room. And then I want you to rearrange the room so that it's convenient for my family, the light doesn't reflect too much off the TV, you can move things around as you think you see fit. If I ask you to do that and say, how long is that going to take you? Certainly if you're in uniform, you'll give me a sharp response and say, probably 15 or 20 minutes, sir, I'll have that sorted out. And I say, okay, problem is, though I haven't given you all the information. Next build on the slide, please. Okay, everything in the room is connected with an invisible cord, and some of those cords go outside of the room, and I don't even know what they're connected to on the outside. Now how long do you think it's going to take you? And the typical response is, I don't know. And this is one of the basic of how we're framing ourselves. I'm trying to open up my organization to some systems theory concepts. Next slide. The other thing is, and it's been mentioned a lot here today, is the difference between complicated and complex systems. We're very good and trained we're trained from kindergarten to break down things into complicated linear systems. Logical, linear, predictable, proportional. The output is proportional to the input. The whole is equal to the sum of the parts, and the environment really doesn't have much to do with the changes in my system. And the illustration here, of course, is a mechanical watch or a clock. The problem is we live in a complex system of systems. The illustration here is a stock exchange. It's often illogical. It's nonlinear. It's adaptive. It's often unpredictable. It's unproportional. I can put in an input one week and get a certain output of the stock market, and I can put the same input a month later and I get a different output. And the external environment certainly can have a huge impact on that system. So some basic concepts like this, trying to get my organization to understand the concepts that I was trying to apply at the tactical level. Next slide. Senge uses the beer game, which some of you may be familiar with. And if you look at the top of the slide, he talks about a typical supply chain where you've got a factory that produces beer, a warehouse that stockpiles it, you got a wholesaler, and then a retailer, a beer store that sells the beer, and eventually the customers are all happy. So you got the inputs to the system and the returns on this system. That's a simple way of illustrating a closed system. Of course, you can take it to a complicated level if you look at the bottom part of the slide, where there's actually more pieces in between each one of those activities. And that's usually where my organization was thinking of themselves, was at the bottom part of the slide. Next, please. The problem is, when you think you have a complex system, next build, as soon as you add people, but you immediately have a complex system. You got relationships, you've got personalities, you've got dogmatic mindsets, you've got chains of command, you've got processes, you've got TTPs. All of that is embedded in your system. Next build. Senge also talks about, he uses the beer game, which was created in the 1960s, sort of a management game where they take organizations like this, and they will split the group up into teams, and each team is divided in, you're a retailer, you're a supplier, you're a wholesaler, and I'm going to let you run free play. And I'm going to introduce only one change in this system. And in that system, there are leads and lags. If you're the retailer, truck shows up at your door, you order your beer for 4 weeks out. So there's a time delay in when your beer actually shows up at your store. And the system has all of those leads and lags in the organization. And I let you run free play. And if you look at the chart on the bottom, I introduce only one change into that system. And that some band released a song that had Lover's Beer, which is the brand of beer in the game, in the lyrics, and that's it. What that creates is, at the retailer, a doubling of their demand from their customers. So if you normally sell 4 cases of beer a week of Lover's Beer, because of this song, you see an effect of, now I sell 8 cases of beer. The problem is, you don't know about that song when this starts. And in the leads and lags of the system between the truck drivers and the wholesalers and the factory, if you look at the chart, eventually everybody is completely out of the beer, and the customers and retailers, everyone's screaming at each other up the chain, only to be followed by the fact that really the only increase was a small doubling of the input of the demand at the start of this system. Everyone has so much beer, the factory has actually laid on extra shifts to produce more beer. They can't give the stuff away. And the only thing that's been changed is a small input at the beginning. This game has been played thousands of times all over the world with all different kinds of cultures, personalities, education levels, and every time this is what happens. And the illustration here is, hey folks, the way our organization is designed affects how we behave within it. Next slide. So, with those basic concepts to my folks, I tried to get their mind around where we needed to go. Next slide. One wing is a tactical organization of 7 squadrons and a tactical headquarters, distributed across the Army bases in Canada. It's over 2,000 people, regular force, reserve, civilian, less than 100 aircraft, infrastructure on those Army bases, and a lot of well-established doctrine for the operations to support the Army and the Special Forces. If I asked someone to tell me, and I did this with my organizations, I said, describe to me our organization, and this is what they would show me, a typical line diagram. Designed at the start of the Cold War, and even when I started in this organization, this is how we were designed. The colored lines represent either an individual squadron or a pair of squadrons, a reg force and a reserve squadron, were paired with we have 3 Army brigades, so we have 3 what we called Sabre squadrons. If the brigade was to deploy, the squadron would deploy with it. And these squadrons are equipped, vehicles, aircraft, people, trades, SOPs, doctrine, everything for an entire squadron, either single or paired, to deploy. I joined in 1986. Since that time, can anyone guess the number of times we've deployed an entire squadron anywhere in the world? Zippo. Absolutely zippo. And I had to try and get this, trying to change this frame to illustrate of where we needed to go. To illustrate that, next slide. Anyone recall the hurricane in the Philippines where Canada deployed our disaster resistance response team? In that organization was a small detachment of 3 Griffin helicopters with about 50 people, primarily based on one squadron out west. What I illustrated to my team, this is a list of every unit in the wing, the Air Force, the Army, and industry that was involved in getting those 3 helicopters with the people over there to fly for 30 days to support that operation. Every single unit had a piece to play, whether it was an airplane, a specific skill set, a piece of equipment, air crew, whatever. This is how we were already operating, and yet we were still designed as a Cold War design. Obviously, something had to change. Next slide. So I put up this slide, to which the response was, certainly in some cases from the chain of command, a bit of a chuckle. Oh, you must have just come out of Staff College, Colonel Whale. I said, this is how we need to reorganize ourselves. We are a system of systems. Why do we have squadrons designed to deploy that we never do? We put out, if you look on the right side of the slide, task-tailored detachments each and every time, and then we support them. So what we had to do was redesign the whole organization. And if you look at the top, it says Air Maintenance Squadron. For an example, we changed the roles of some of the squadrons. So instead of independent squadrons, none of these squadrons can operate independently, and they don't need to. So they don't need all the tents, they don't need all the vehicles. And in one case, the squadron in Borden, I took away their airplanes and told them, you're now a maintenance squadron. Imagine how well that went over, okay? But when you show them the whole picture and the efficiencies that can be gained, this is what we had to do. Next slide. So as one example of the 150-page master implementation, 5-year master implementation plan that we had to develop to transition this organization to be more efficient with a better output, here's an example of the plus and minus in positions, in people at each one of those organizations. Looks fairly straightforward, maybe a little complicated if you think about some of them are pilots, some of them are technicians, et cetera. The problem is, the reality was, next slide, this is how complex it was. Okay, you trade one sergeant for a corporal, we traded in pilots for technicians because we realized we had more pilots than the technicians could sustain the aircraft rate to support, so why have pilots sitting on the rucksack? This is how complex it was. And they needed to see this and understand this before they would not only buy in to this transformation, actually enroll themselves in it and see themselves in it at the squadron level. Next slide. So essentially my challenge was taking this frame of what they were as an organization, next build, and illustrate to them that we're actually part of a ecosystem here with Army, Air Force at the operational strategic level, Special Forces, Armed Forces, the department, and even industry partners completely integrated into this system. Next build. We didn't even have control within our organization. We certainly didn't have it in this ecosystem. Next build. So I tried to keep them focused on this band of influence to make that 5-year plan work. And as an example of all those rank and trade changes that had to happen, I sent a small army to Ottawa to the career managers to tell them in 3 years, we're going to be asking for more technicians, less pilots, and here's why and here's how it fits. Does this work? What are your concerns? What are your requirements? So that by the time I was sitting in front of the commander of the Air Force pitching this plan, I could tell him with confidence that there was a way to make this work. And I can tell you that as of last week, the last group of individuals in that big complex chart received their posting messages, and that transformation is almost complete. But these theories work. They have application, and if you help your organization understand them, even at that most basic level, which I hope I've illustrated, It's very powerful.